So for those who are joining us, since there's two of us presenting, we're going to treat this more or less as a conversational podcast where we will both speak on the slides as appropriate. We should have plenty of time for a Q&A at the end, but if you do have a burning question, I know I will keep the webinar chat up so that we can possibly answer those questions as close to the content as you have them. So that way, when you receive your recording of this webinar within a week or so, keep in mind this is a holiday weekend for us in the States. So within a week, you should receive a recording, which also will have the PowerPoint. You'll be able to have content, questions spoken aloud, and then the response given. So that way everything will help reinforce the material. So that's the plan. So if everyone's ready to go, we can get started. I am Dr. Joanna Broussard, the qualitative mentor with Statistics Solutions.
And my name is Kai Signori. I am not a doctor. I wish I was. No, I'm kidding. But I am the quantitative mentor here at Statistics Solutions.
And we are a full-service dissertation consulting and editing company that can help you with all of your scholarly needs, from project development all the way through preparing for your final defense and turning your dissertation into a journal article. We'll talk more about that at the end. So let's get started. Just in general, starting with basics, what is methodology? So as I'm sure you guys are aware from your coursework, your research methods are a specific set of procedures and techniques that you use to identify, process, and analyze information about a topic or a concept. All research methodologies follow specific scientific procedures that you, as the researcher, must lay out. And so when you're deciding whether you're going to use qualitative or quantitative, and even within those two broad categories, you have to answer two questions. How will you collect your data, and how will you analyze this data? Kai, anything?
Yeah, totally. So a lot of the time I like to tell all of my clients this, whether or not it's qualitative or quantitative data, or types of data analysis or research methods that you're doing. A lot of the times, a methodology is very similar to like a recipe, right? So when you're baking cookies or a cake or something like that, you trust that the recipe that you're following is going to, be exact. It's going to be specific. It's going to tell you exactly the steps that you need to accomplish in order to get the perfect chocolate chip cookie recipe every single time. And so your methodology should be fairly similar to this. You should be very specific about the type of data that you want to collect, why you want to collect it that way, how you're going to collect that. And you want to make your research methods, and this is specific for quantitative, but I'm sure it's the same for qualitative. You want to make it so that someone who reads your paper is able to read your methodology very similarly to that of a recipe, if they were reading a recipe, right? So you want to be able to go back and know exactly what the researcher did, know exactly why they did it, and what the outcomes are predicted to be based on what they're doing and why. And so I like to tell a lot of my clients that you should treat it like it's a recipe, because it almost is. We're putting everything together and making a fun little cookie, except for a cookie is research, and research is sometimes more fun than a cookie. So
Oh no, that's a wonderful analogy, because it even for qualitative, where we're not doing as much with numbers, you do need to know exactly what you're going to do step by step, because the steps you take from collection, or from deciding what to collect, how to collect it, and then how to analyze it, can have impacts on how the results come out.
Absolutely.
So
That's the same for quantitative.
Reading it, if someone else is reading, like you've probably read some academic papers. I know instead of having a dissertation template, my department made us go and read 5 dissertations from our department that did similar things and do a structural analysis. It's hard to then determine if someone actually accomplish what they set out to accomplish in research if you can't figure out how they did what they said they were going to do.
Exactly. That's exactly it.
So it's part of makes it easier for you to do what you want to do, and it makes it easier for others who follow to determine your credibility. You know, if you're learning a methodology, people who are detailed and clear when they write it out make it easier for you to learn that methodology.
Exactly. That's exactly it.
So that's why you really need to think very clearly, especially at the beginning. What do I need to collect to answer my question? How do I think I'm going to do it? And as we'll tell you probably throughout, I know I tell clients throughout the process, your methodology sometimes might change.
Oh,
Things
absolutely.
happen. And we'll talk more about that later, but let's get through some of the basics right now with, because we do need to think about why choosing an appropriate methodology is important. Kai, you want to start with this?
Yeah, absolutely. And so, kind of going to what we were saying earlier, about, being able to replicate, being able to look back and see what exactly it is that you did. Those are reasons why a methodology is important. And another reason the methodology is really important and choosing the appropriate one is important is because that if you choose a methodology that is unreliable, it's highly likely your results are going to be unreliable as well. So a lot of the times people will say like, oh, I'm just going to choose a methodology, and they don't really think too hard about what goes into that. And so maybe they choose something that's quantitative, and, very numbers based, all that fun stuff. We'll get into, what quantitative research really is, in a little bit, but they'll choose quantitative, but then maybe they don't lay out exactly what they need to for that quantitative data. And once they get to the results, they realize that half their data isn't even quantitative. Maybe a lot of their data is these open-ended questions that they didn't even think about before, and they didn't think about what they were going to do with that. And now you're at a point where you've already collected data. You have all of this stuff to analyze, and you don't know what to do with it anymore. And that's because maybe one way or the other, your methodology was unreliable. You didn't think clearly about what you wanted to do. And you really want to use the methodology as a basis, as like a framework for what you're going to do moving forward. And so if that framework is flawed, moving forward is also going to be flawed. And so you want to make sure that we're choosing a methodology that aligns with not only your research goals, but also the data that you are able to collect. So even if you are at a point where you know what you want to do, but maybe collecting that type of data, maybe looking at whatever variable you're interested in is incredibly difficult from a quantitative standpoint, but maybe not as difficult from a qualitative standpoint. And so if at that point you still choose quantitative, you're not going to get a lot out of the data analysis anymore if the data isn't right for the type of analysis that you've chosen.
And that's one of the things that I've had to deal with a few clients recently, just speaking in general terms, clients who figured, oh, I want to do a qualitative analysis because I want to learn about this.
Mm-hmm.
And then they ask questions that are very much quantitative.
Yeah, I have that a lot. I see a lot of people ask open-ended questions for for quantitative data. And, I have to tell them like, hey, unfortunately, this isn't very usable with the rest of your study. I mean, we can do like, a little bit of qualitative stuff towards the end, but this stuff can't be incorporated into quantitative analysis. It just can't.
And then, sometimes you have people who, are maybe pushed towards a methodology by a chair and are unfamiliar with it.
Mm-hmm. That's a big one too.
So it can lead to a lot of mistakes, which is why, planning early. And one of the hardest things to do in grad school is advocate for the research design you need.
Absolutely.
And so that's why I do mention, if a client, I've had clients who said, well, I figured this would be the design I wanted, but my chair is more versed in this. So I'm switching, but I don't know how to do this.
Mm-hmm.
And that doesn't help. the client as a researcher because you're unfamiliar, you're scared, and it's hard enough to learn one type of methodology in grad school and write a dissertation with it, but to have moved in a direction for 3, 4, 5 years of coursework and then have to switch and pivot, it can be a lot. So
I think it's
being
also
able to choose, yeah, go
yeah,
ahead.
no, sorry. I also just kind of piggybacking off of that. I also think it's a timing thing, right?
Right.
So a lot of the times, I say it all the time, quantitative methodology, I think, is harder on the front end and a lot easier on the back end, right? So it's a lot harder when it comes to figuring out your methodology, picking all of the right instruments, making sure they're validated, all of this fun stuff. Well, that's not really, it's a little tedious. I find it fun, but it's a lot harder on the front end in the planning stages. Whereas data analysis, as long as you have a baseline understanding of statistics, it's fairly straightforward. And it doesn't take you a lot of time on the back end or on the analysis end. But qualitative, on the other hand, is kind of the opposite, right? It takes not a lot of time to kind of figure out what you want to do and figure out how you want to code it. But then the coding and all of it just takes forever. And so it's a lot of time on the back end rather than quantitative. And so choosing the methodology that's right for you is also choosing a timeline for yourself. So if you're choosing a quantitative methodology, you now know that you're going to spend a lot of time on our research methods, and that maybe the data analysis, as long as you don't have to teach yourself some statistics, is going to not be as time consuming for you. Whereas if you're going to choose a qualitative methodology, that a lot of your back end, your data analysis, your content analysis is going to take you a lot more time than your methodology does. And so choosing the correct methodology is also going to allow you to plan a little bit better for your time and to do some time management stuff as well.
And that moves us into discussing the types of research methods. So let's start with quantitative.
Okay, I'll just keep on talking. My favorite thing. I love to talk. So first, like Johanna said, we're going to talk about quantitative research. And quantitative research is the process of collecting and analyzing numerical data. And that emphasis on collecting the numerical data, excuse me, I had a little burp there, is placed on the testing of theory and those theories that have been previously shaped by other researchers, empiricists, philosophies, stuff like that, right? And so it's very numbers based, very analytical. Quantitative research is characterized by a few things. First, I think I kind of mentioned it a little bit earlier, but you need measurable variables. What I mean by this is you want variables that you can quantitatively, with numbers, measure. So levels of stress, you can measure someone's level of stress. Maybe that's cortisol levels, right? Maybe we're taking their spit and we're looking at how much cortisol they have, and that's going to come out as a number, right? Where versus, if we're looking at something a little bit more vague, like just, I don't know, just general stress, like, then maybe qualitative is going to be something, but we'll get into that in a little bit. Next is, very similarly to measurable variables, is the use of standardized research tools. What I mean by this is that surveys, paradigms, stuff like that have been run and validated by previous research. So that's very important in quantitative research. We call it validated surveys or validated questionnaires, stuff like that. Next is repeatable methods. I think I also mentioned this a little bit earlier with my recipe analogy. It's really important for quantitative research to be able to replicate the research that you have done. It's really important to be able to, do exactly the same thing that a previous research has done or researcher has accomplished, and be able to, whether or not you find the same results, you're still going to use the same measures, the same, maybe not the same participant pool, but maybe the same types of participants. Maybe you looked at healthcare workers the first time, and so you want to do a replicable study and you look at healthcare workers again. So you want to be able to read those methodologies, especially for quantitative, read through them, and then be able to replicate them. So they need to be specific enough for that. Another characteristic of quantitative research is that a lot of quantitative research can actually predict outcomes. So if you're using something like a regression, excuse me, then you're going to actually look at, okay, well, does this level of stress predict their, this participant's susceptibility to misinformation? I use this example every time because it was my thesis project, and I have no other examples in my head. But you're able to predict, okay, well, maybe higher stress is, predictive of more susceptibility to misinformation, or maybe it's not. That's not something that you're able to do with a qualitative design. Another characteristic is that your data is presented in graphs, tables, and figures. It's all presented numerically for the most part. Frequencies and percentages, means and standard deviations, histograms, stuff like that. And then finally, kind of the biggest characteristic is the nature of the questions. So the majority, if not all, of your questions in a quantitative research design should be close-ended, meaning that there's not a lot of room to expand. Expansion is not helpful in quantitative research because there's not really a use for it, unfortunately. And that's why we do have qualitative research. It's good for that stuff. But if your data is mostly close-ended questions, it's mostly numbers, then a quantitative study might be right for you, In terms of the research designs, there's a couple different types of quantitative research designs. So we've got our experimental research designs. This is in which we're having a causal relationship. It's one where we are manipulating an independent variable and trying to see that effect of that manipulation on that dependent variable. That manipulation is really important for an experimental design, right? So maybe that manipulation is putting someone into a control group versus an experimental group. Maybe one person gets the placebo drug versus the other person getting the actual helpful drug. Those are, categories that you can randomly assign people into. That's another big thing about experimental research designs, is that it has a lot to do with random assignment. Everybody has an equal opportunity to either be in that placebo group or to be in that experimental group. And so that's kind of the holy grail of research designs, are experimental designs. It's definitely the ones in which we put a lot more emphasis on in quantitative spaces. And that's because you're able to actually see a causal relationship with those types of data analysis. And so if you're really looking for a cause and effect relationship, then maybe an experimental research design is going to be best for you. Next is non-experimental or a correlational design. So something like a non-experimental design is something in which we are, not manipulating any variables. Maybe this is something like an observational study where you're just kind of watching and making observations like that. Or, maybe it's something where you have pre-existing groups, right? Like, we're not going to randomly assign people into men and women. And yet if you're interested in looking at differences between gender or sex or anything like that, then, we don't want to randomly assign those people into that. And so we have a pre-existing group kind of already there. And yeah, so that's a lot of non-experimental is where you're not manipulating an independent variable. And then quasi-experimental is when you have an independent variable, but that independent variable is a pre-existing group. Another example of a pre-existing group is maybe classrooms, right? Maybe you have two classrooms and you're interested in one class dealing with a new teaching method that you've come up with. And then maybe your second class, you're just going to keep on teaching them the way you've always taught them. Well, if they're already in those classes, why would you disrupt them and randomly assign them into new classes? That's it doesn't necessarily seem feasible. And that's the biggest thing with experimental research. A lot of the times there are pros and cons to it. So a true experimental design isn't always feasible. Like I said, we're not randomly assigning people into categories in which they already exist. That's a little messed up and unethical. And so when that happens, and frankly, it happens a lot, you can still run quantitative analyses, but it's going to be more correlational, more based in relationships rather than looking for a causal relationship of cause and effect. Looks like, yeah, question in the question answer, what does it mean by true experimental? Yeah, so I just mean, when I say that is, I just mean that we have an independent variable that we are manipulating, and we have random assignment into those groups. That is a true experimental design. Really, it is where you try to control for as many variables as possible. And you do that by manipulating a variable. Yeah. I hope that makes sense. And please let me know if it doesn't. I can do a different explanation. But yeah, that's basically all I had for this slide. If you
All right, let us move over to qualitative research now. I'll take over. Qualitative research is the process of collecting and analyzing non-numerical data, text, video, audio, human social interaction, which can be multimodal, festival, ritual, everything you see, everything people can do. There are ways to analyze these products, these processes, and these interactions to understand concepts, opinions, experiences. We often phrase our questions in terms of perceptions. What are the perceptions of people doing this? Before I move forward, we do have a question that seems to be about quantitative. So Kai, would you take the question into Q&A?
Yep, can do. Greetings. What if I'm looking at influence? Is it experimental? So that again, it really depends, right? So it depends on how you measure it, and I think we'll kind of be able to answer this question in a little bit better in a couple slides, because we really talk about what kind of data is best for what. So if you're interested in looking at, influence, is that your dependent variable? Okay, that's cool. How are you going to measure that? And then how you measure that depends on, or then influences, which type of data analysis you're going to do. So, are you interested in, the complex of, what are the influences of this based, in, or what are the perceptions of people's influences on this? Then, maybe you ask an open-ended question that gives you a lot of nuance. Or, maybe you have a way to quantitatively measure that influence. Maybe there's a survey out there. Maybe there's a paradigm out there where you're able to measure that variable in a quantitative way. And so if you're able to do it numerically, then sometimes a quantitative analysis is going to be better for you. So I hate to say it depends, but it does depend.
That's one of those frustrating answers that is often the most accurate answer to give in a situation.
Yeah, I
I
hate saying it depends, because I remember when I was in grad school and I kept asking questions and everyone kept saying, well, it depends. And I was like, well, that's not an answer. But unfortunately, it kind of is. And as frustrating as it could be to hear, it sometimes really does depend on what exactly you're looking to do, and what exactly types of data that you actually have access to and have availability to.
And that is one of those things that, why you have to think about all of this from the very beginning, because a lot of concepts can be studied either quantitatively or qualitatively. And it depends on what you want to know, how you want to seek it, and what you plan to do with it. So let's get back to talking about qualitative research methods for a second. Because as I said, here we're often looking at ideas, opinions, experiences, perceptions. Often qualitative research is characterized by research being conducted within the natural environment in situ. I've got friends who studied cross-generational communication in massively multiplayer online video games. And she studied this communication in
That is a
real
cool
time
topic.
while these people played MMO, specifically World of Warcraft. I've got anthropology friends who studied voodoo in Haiti. They went to Haiti to study the practice of voodoo. I've got friends who studied cosplay at Comic-Con, and they went to Comic-Con to study the practice and the performance of cosplay. A really good friend of mine, Ari Gratch, he studied dark tourism at sites related to Jewish rebellions against the Romans in Israel. So he conducted his research on how tourists experience these sites there.
And not to
Now,
like cut in or anything real quick, but none of those things you can measure quantitatively.
no, you can't. You
Like
really
I
can't.
wouldn't know how to measure cosplay as a quantitative variable unless that variable is, do you cosplay, yes or no, and it's that's all it is, you know. To get those nuances of those things, you do have to do qualitative research, because quantitative just can't measure some of those things.
Exactly.
And they're still worth researching. Sorry, didn't mean to cut you
Oh, no,
off there.
that's fine. No. And we often do have multiple sources of data, whether it be multiple interviews plus focus groups, interview plus document analysis, interview plus observation. It's, depending on what we are studying, like let's say you were trying to study low performing schools or schools who are low performing on certain standardized tests. Well, you could look at the standardized test results and see, oh, these students are not doing well. But without seeing, looking at the school environment, looking at, classroom size, looking at what materials are in the classroom, speaking with students to learn how many came to the test while being sick, or how many had to work to support the family the night before, or all sorts of other sometimes I was taught to say the stories behind the data is what qualitative research allows you to see. It allows you to take that which we can observe and find the human element. But we have multiple sources of data. My master's thesis looked at performance of masculinity through boasting in the Icelandic sagas. So I had the sagas in the original Old Norse, which I learned for that specific purpose, as well as archaeological evidence. I did a little bit of, while I can't go to 13th century Iceland, I did go to Iceland to participate in what's called a saga tour, where they take you to the sites mentioned in the saga and they read the section. So I could see how these places looked now, what's left of them. And in some cases, a lot still left, but in some cases, a lot isn't. But being able to be in the environment, just to observe the landscape, which hasn't changed a whole lot in Iceland since the 13th century. And so that, plus the document, plus the archaeology, to get a sense of what we know of the culture. Plus, I even looked at some church records to get a sense of other perspectives on this culture at the time. We look at all of these sources of data to triangulate and to get as full a picture as possible. We often use inductive data analysis. We build our ideas from the data up. Or as my thesis director, Dr. Mary Brody, said, we let the data speak to us. Coding comes from looking at the data and pulling out the ideas that emerge, as opposed to a deductive approach where we would go in with a set of codes and just plug the data into that set. Can that be done with qualitative data? Yes. However, you will, more often than not, researchers have found that doing that produces highly unsatisfactory and often inaccurate forced results. So an inductive approach really is the way to go. Your design develops over time. It changes as you go. Sometimes you might go in thinking, oh, I'm just going to get a few interviews. Well, maybe I need to do some then something realizes, oh, I need to do some observation, or oh, I need new documents. And so you have to sometimes revisit your design. When I finish going over the characteristics, we'll come back to this question that's in the Q&A, because I do want to get over through a lot of these. The researcher is the key instrument. You are the primary means through which data is collected and analyzed. You don't, any other instruments like an interview protocol, document analysis sheets, things like that, you often have to develop yourself, which means you need to spend some time justifying the questions you ask, making sure you have time for IRB approval of all of this, and so on and so forth. But you are the primary instrument. You are the one who talks to people. You are the one who observes, and you have to think about how your presence can influence the data you collect. As you know, it should be clear from everything both of us have said, this is very much a holistic and interpretive approach. While we have our analysis methods that are very clear cut, like Braun and Clark's 6-step thematic analysis, we have the steps in place, but what goes into each step is something that is different every time. And you are the one who is interpreting the data and trying to find meaning. That's why we stress very, very deeply spending time with the data, really immersing yourself in it. And then once you draft up like say a first round of your analysis, sending it out to your participants to say, hey, this is what seemed to come out of my analysis of everyone. Does this gel? Does this mesh with your experience? Because while you are the researcher, you are looking at these people's lived experiences and how they experience a phenomenon, a concept. And I'll talk more about these things in a second when we get into research strategies, but you will be using a lot of open-ended questions. Instead of, do you experience stress? You'll be asking questions like, what does stress feel like in your body? Or tell me about a time when you felt highly stressed. Or how do you define high levels of stress? You want to have questions that don't go for yes, no, once a month, 3 days a year. You want people to get talking. You want people to give details. You are asking for people to give you insight into their minds, their lives, and their cultures in various fashions. So, Kai, I do believe we're back to the same thing on influence of human resource information system on workers' retention.
Yeah. So the question is, like, will it be an experimental design or a mixed method if you have both quantitative and qualitative? Just looking at the question, just the influence of human resource information systems on workers' retention. It depends on, I hate saying it depends. But it depends on how you're going to define worker retention, but it does sound like that's a quantitative sort of experiment there. It does look like, just based off of that, I wouldn't call that an experimental design. You could make it a quantitative design, but that would probably be something more of along the lines of a non-experimental or even a quasi-experimental, just because we're not, manipulating who's in what human resource group or who's seeing what human resource information system, unless you are, if you can manipulate that. But that doesn't necessarily seem like something that's manipulatable. Is that a word? I don't think that's a word, but that's not the point. And so, it depends on what we're manipulating here. So based on that dependent variable, that workers retention, I would argue that you probably have some sort of quantitative data, because, X amount of workers this year left the company. X amount of workers said that they wanted to leave the company, or maybe X amount of workers stayed at this company, and that's your retention rate here. And so, that's very quantitative in nature. But unless we're manipulating that independent variable, unless we're manipulating human resource information systems, it's probably going to be more of a non-experimental or a quasi-experimental design. In which case you can't prove causality, but you can definitely make predictions, and you can still use quantitative analysis to examine those relationships and make predictions about what might happen in the future. If you then wanted to also add a qualitative aspect to it, maybe you ask these questions about workers' retention, and then at the end of the survey you say, why'd you leave? Tell me about it. Tell me more, then you might be getting more into a mixed method study, where, and we'll get to that, I think, in the next slide of kind of what a mixed methods looks like. But that is kind of what a mixed methods would look like, right? So you have a bunch of quantitative questions, asking about this dependent variable. And then at the end, maybe you have a couple extra qualitative questions, that are open-ended to ask, why did you respond this way, and or why not, and then you can analyze it that way as well.
Okay, and I know we have one, how do you get validity or reliability in a phenomenological study? We'll get to that. Let's not get ahead of ourselves, because we haven't even defined what phenomenology is yet. So don't get ahead of us, because we do quite a bit to go through, and so we can't always answer every specific question about specific studies in the time of the webinar.
I will say these are pretty good questions, though.
These are very good
I
questions.
do appreciate people, asking these well thought out questions for sure.
But, as we want to talk about, we do have several research strategies. Ethnography, the hallmark of the discipline of anthropology, where you study a culture in situ, where you often go for extended periods of time to live amongst a group of people, participating while you observe. Often you don't have a lot of interviews. You'll have maybe 2 or 3 key interlocutors. I know a lot of people refer to their people in their study as participants. Anthropology, at least back when I got my master's, the term that was preferred was interlocutors, people with whom we were speaking and communicating, to try and ease that power imbalance between researcher and participant, which can often lead to people not being comfortable speaking openly. But ethnography, long periods of time, you've got to plan for that. You may have to participate, but you will at the very least be observing a cultural phenomenon. Like I said, cosplay at Comic-Con, Mardi Gras festival in rural Louisiana, small towns, harvest festivals in Eastern Europe, or any type of event, cultural practices, barter, and open air markets. Anything that is connected to culture can be studied ethnographically. Some famous ethnographers have also studied drug dealers and organized crime members. You've got to be careful doing things like that, because it can put you in physical danger. So, but ethnography, you study people by participating and observing their lives in their cultural setting. Case studies. This is often where you'll pick, say, a specific, I want to study the practices of English language learning teachers for middle school math in this particular school or this particular school district, to see what they're doing, because according to test scores, they're having either an unusually high level of success, or they're having less success than should be expected. And I want to know what and why. Narrative, in broad context, that's the study of stories. Life history, oral tale telling, which still happens throughout the world. Narrative can also be looking at texts and historical narrative documents. Phenomenology, which is where you are trying really hard to get at the essential core common experience. I've got a client working on the phenomenon of self-care amongst community mental health professionals. And so how do we get all of these things like reliability and confirmability? Very, very careful work, being honest and reflexive in our process, being sure that with phenomenology, we bracket out our assumptions, member checking to make sure that what we find is something that seems to gel with the core experience of our participants, and things of that nature. A lot of these methods, there are many other methods that will depend specifically upon what you're doing. And as I've said, going into specifics, we really don't have a lot of time to go through all of that and make sure we get through all of the slides. But that is something that can be talked about either in other webinars, maybe we'll do one specifically on each method, or through consultation. And then there's, of course, grounded theory. Grounded theory is attractive to a lot of people coming from quantitative backgrounds because you are trying to produce a theory that is grounded in data. It is something that I've seen clients and I've seen colleagues and friends burn out on, because after you collect your initial set of data and then you produce your first round of your theory, you then have to find more participants and then see if your theory holds up. And if not, you may have to make adjustments based on the new data, and you have to keep doing that until you reach theoretical saturation, the point at which no new data emerges that changes the structure of your theory. Grounded theory is something that really does take years to complete. It is not something that I would advise a novice or a graduate student, primarily because your school is going to want you to finish your dissertation usually within 1 or 2 years for matriculation purposes. And so this is something to begin working on once you get tenure. Once you know that you have the time, and also because it does require a level of dexterity with your method to know when you need to adjust, when you need to shift question, when you need to do follow-up, when you need to push and probe, and when you need to back off. And that's something that you don't get after one round of interviews. It takes time to develop these instincts. And of course, what happens if I want to do qualitative, but it doesn't fit into any one of these? While we don't talk about it a lot, there is what's called a general qualitative study. If it doesn't fit neatly into one of the categories I've described, it's a general qualitative study. Most dissertations really do fall under either general qualitative or case study. And so that's probably what you'll be looking at, because it's easy to move forward. It's quick. These are the ones that often take the least amount of planning forefront and of time consumption. A case study, you might just have one to three cases. You'll probably have, and we'll talk about this in a bit, smaller data sizes. But we will be talking about, methods and collecting data, because that is something you do need to think about. But after that, before that, we do want to talk about mixed methods, because both of us have dealt with a few clients who have had mixed methods. And sometimes you do want or you need to collect both types of data. We've been discussing that with Johannes's in an example that they gave, which is a really good example of something that could be multiple research projects depending on what specifically you want to learn and how you want to learn it. But mixed methods is where you will be collecting both open and closed data in response to your research questions. Kai, you've had more experience working with clients who've had both. Why don't you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, totally. And so kind of like I was saying earlier, and like Johanna was saying, the question that we got earlier was a really good example of what could honestly be both. It could be both quantitative and qualitative. And a lot of the times, you know, those mixed methods are you kind of pick one or the other to be the more forward of the two. So what I mean by that is, say, you know, you are interested in the impact of human resource information systems on worker retention. I'm just going to use that example because I can't think of a different one at the time. But say you are interested in that. And, you know, like Johanna was saying, with qualitative research, you know, the instrument is the person, but maybe, you know, maybe you have validated instruments. Maybe you have a survey that's already been written out that already has these questions, that has some scoring information on how you would be able to score retention rates on a quantitative level. And so maybe you put that as your method that is the more forward method, the more prominent method here. So maybe quantitative is kind of where you're shining here, and then at the end you go, oh well, I also kind of want to know why, but we can't tell why with quantitative. So let me tack on a few extra questions at the end that are open-ended, that, you know, maybe we could do some sort of general qualitative analysis with this afterwards, and to kind of determine, okay, well, this relationship is happening. Why not? Why are people responding this way? What do they have to say about that? And so that's what a lot of the mixed methods that I have done look like. There is, of course, the opposite end of the spectrum where your qualitative is the more forward one here. So maybe you are more interested in the why. You don't really care as much about the cause and effect quantitative impacts of, you know, this specific information system. Does it produce more or less retention rates? Maybe you're not interested in that as much. I mean, you're interested in it, right? But maybe you're not like full gung-ho on knowing, you know, the very quantitative statistical analysis part of that. So you put your qualitative research as your foot forward here, and you do a lot of interviews. Maybe within those interviews, though, you tack on a few questions at the end that are very close-ended, right? And you kind of do the opposite of what I described first. So you spend a lot of time on your qualitative, and then, you know, you get to a point where you're like, okay, here are my theories. Here's what I think is going on. I also have this quantitative data. Let me see what just the relationships are shaking out to be. Does it match with the qualitative data that I have looked at? You know, are there written experiences matching up with the experiences that we were able to score, and the experiences that we were able to you know, measure numerically? Are those relationships matching up with the relationships that we saw in the qualitative data? And so a lot of mixed methods research is doing both, and then kind of trying to bridge the two by, you know, comparison, right? Like, are the topics and the conclusions that we're coming to with one matching up with the topics and the conclusions that we're coming to with the other? And if not, why not? You know? And mixed methods can be really fun, but they can also be very time consuming, because like I've said before, and like Johanna said, qualitative specifically can be a lot of work. And so just be sure when you're going into a mixed methods that you understand it might be a little bit more work than just doing maybe quantitative or just doing qualitative.
And I would add that also mixed methods, while it can produce some amazingly detailed, rich results, it's something I've seen a lot of people mess up on, because they'll say it's mixed methods, but it'll be this huge, like 80 question quantitative survey with,
and then like one
question.
Qualitative question at the end. Yeah. That's so
And
fair.
I've seen the opposite happen. So from qualitative, people feel they need to have some sort of
Measurable
numerical statistical data to maybe it's a departmental requirement. Maybe the department chair
Yeah,
doesn't really
that's a good
doesn't
point.
really care about qualitative research. I've been in departments like that.
I've seen people who also don't care as much about quantitative, and they just only care about the qualitative aspect of it. A lot of this is, you choose what's appropriate for you, but you also choose what your chair kind of wants of you sometimes. Because or what you have. Someone said in the comments, the
Best
best
dissertation
dissertations
is
in.
a done
Yes,
dissertation.
that is the most accurate thing that I have ever heard. And
That
that I
really,
say all the
really
time.
is.
I say it all the time.
Oh no,
You want to do what you can get done. And then once you're a professor, once you're tenured, once you have that degree, then you can go do your crazy stuff. Go do it then. Get your dissertation done, Get out of here before you get sucked into a really long time commitment just to get your thesis done.
the advice that listening scholar Graham Bodie gave us in graduate school was: one, the best dissertation is a done dissertation. And two, recognize that your dissertation is not the project you dream of it being.
Mm-hmm.
It is document by committee.
Yeah,
And so
very
you
true.
are putting together a document to meet the approval of a committee. Once you've gotten their approval, you can then turn it into the study you felt it needed to be
Mm-hmm.
when
A
you
lot
have
of
time and
oh,
funding.
yeah, and kind of piggybacking off of that, a lot of dissertations and theses and masters and PhD level research is less obviously, you're probably going to try and publish it, but it's less about adding to the body of research and more about just learning how to do the research and learning how to do it effectively. The committee serves to kind of act like you know a checks and balance system so that you're not messing it up, and you should definitely try to treat your dissertation more as a learning experience than anything else, in my opinion, at least.
It is. I know. I've mentioned Dr. Brody before, and she described it as when you're in grad school, you are junior colleagues being mentored by your senior, by your chair, by your
Exactly.
committee, or for those of us who've studied the Middle Ages, you are an apprentice in a guild, and they are trying to move. The masters are moving you from apprentice to journeyman.
Exactly. And so like when you're an apprentice, you're not making armor for people, like say you're a blacksmith apprentice, you're not making armor for people to go right on the battlefield right now. You barely know what you're doing. Your armor's probably not going to save anyone.
Armor for training purposes.
Exactly. It's not going to be for the
this
battlefield.
is your training. This is a training study. It needs to be done well,
and
it needs to be done to the best of your abilities.
But
it is something that, can you mine it for publication for 5 to 10 years? Yes. But you also, once you get the stamp of approval, you can then say, okay, I made these mistakes. Now that I know a little bit more about what I'm doing, I understand the process better, I can maybe redo it.
Exactly.
And so don't think of it as, well, if I screw up, that's it. It is a learning opportunity. That wonderful aphorism, it's not how many times you fall down, it's how many times you pick yourself up. Learn from the process. And so and with mixed methods, it can be rich, but it's easy to get caught up in well, how do I balance everything? You learn as you go. What happens if I will people notice if I give short shrift to one and not the other? Maybe, maybe not. But honestly, hopefully your chair will be a really good guidance during the entire process.
Completely
that is
agree.
Their purpose. And so open communication with your chair. If you're stuck, there's someone you should be able to go to and say, look, I don't know what I want to do. Help. Here's some ideas that I have. Always come to your chair with ideas. And now let's talk about some factors to consider when you're choosing a methodology. We've been going over these factors, but we're going to be really focused in talking about factors now related to your research questions and your hypotheses. So you do want all of these to match with your method. We've been mentioning that. What is the, there are certain questions that are very quantitative. There are certain question formats that are qualitative. As I said, with qualitative, you might be asking, what are the perceptions of people related, related to a particular phenomenon? Or, I think using my thesis on boasting and masculinity in Old Icelandic literature, how do 13th century Icelandic males, based upon what we have in the written record, understand the concept of masculinity? And then how do they perform it through these intricate, ritualized contests featuring boasts and insults, which led to sub-questions of what types of things are boast-worthy? What types of things are insult-worthy? Are there any categories of behavior that are boast only and insult only? The answer to that last one was yes, but and sometimes it's not what we would think in the modern world, because they did have a different conception of what it meant to be masculine. But these are but we're trying to figure out ideas, perceptions, understanding, experiences. How do people experience stress? Could, depending on whether you want to look at cortisol levels or mental framework, mental schemata, how people understand it from the way they talk about stress, could be one or the other. We don't often have hypotheses in qualitative studies, so I'll let Kai.
Yeah, totally. And so kind of very differently, I think, than qualitative research, quantitative research questions have to be specific. Not only do they have to be specific for quantitative research itself, it also has to be specific for the type of analysis that you're going to run. So different types of quantitative questions have different types of statistical analyses that are associated with them. And all of these research questions should not only align with the purpose of your study and the type of the data that you have, but it also needs to align with one of these statistical analyses that you plan to run. There are three general types of quantitative research questions. First is descriptive. These are questions in which the majority of the data analysis that you're going to run are descriptive statistics, means, standard deviations. What does the data look like? Just generally, what does it look like? So a good example of a question could be, how many women, or how many people who identify as women are within this HR company, something like that, right? Where, the question is very straightforward and you're looking for, okay, there are 15 women, N equals 15. And so we're gonna, what is the amount of stress that people experience at their workplace could be another descriptive question. At that point, then you maybe report the mean and the standard deviation. Well, on average, people report that they are, a mean of 45 on this stress scale, where higher, where the range is from 0 to 50, and higher scores indicate more stress. And so if they're scoring at a mean of 45 on average, then they're stressed. And so that's something like a descriptive. Next is comparative. So comparative is when we are looking at differences, right? Like, what is the difference in the means of stress between male and female participants? Is there a statistically significant difference in, maybe the levels of retention rate based on the type of HR information that they have been exposed to? And so in this section, comparative analyses are things like a t-test, or an ANOVA, where we are comparing means. We're comparing the averages between groups. And then finally, there are relational questions. And just kind of what it sounds like, these are questions where we are looking for relationships. And there are two types of relational questions. One is just a general relational question. What is the relationship between variable X and variable Y? What is the relationship between stress and BMI, right? What is the relationship between I don't know. I'm not good with examples. I keep going to stress because like that's what I was that's what I did my entire thesis on, and all of my stuff was on stress because I was very interested in it. And I was also consequently very stressed. But that's just like a funny haha. But and so that's a baseline relational question. For something like this, we might run a correlation. Whereas we have also predictive relational questions. These are questions in which you want to make a prediction. Does the type of HR information they were exposed to predict whether or not they're going to leave this company? Does the amount of stress that they are exposed to predict whether or not they're going to be susceptible to some misinformation, to me lying right to your face, and so those predictive relationship questions are more aligned with a regression, or mostly just regressions. And so it does depend on what you want out of this data. What are you actually hoping to accomplish here? Are you just looking for baseline relationships, or are we interested in something predictive? Or are we interested not in anything of predictive? Maybe we're interested in differences in groups, and that's going to be more of a comparative design. And so based on each question, you're going to have hypotheses that relate. So there are two types of hypotheses in quantitative research. One is the null hypothesis. The null hypothesis is saying that there is no effect, none, null. And so for something like a comparative design, maybe the null hypothesis would be there isn't a difference. There's not a difference in stress, in levels of stress between male and female participants, maybe. So that would be a null hypothesis. An alternative hypothesis, on the other hand, is the hypothesis of what if there is an effect? So if your null hypothesis is there is no effect, your alternative hypothesis is there is a difference in levels of stress between your male and your female students, or your male and your female participants, stuff like that. And both hypotheses are actually going to be present at the same time. That's the beauty of statistical analyses. We don't really know what it's going to come out to, so we have to kind of create two hypotheses. One for it's not going to do anything, and two for it is going to do something. And then when we run our statistical analysis, we're basing that statistical analysis off of the null. So we're saying, okay, are we rejecting the null hypothesis? Meaning, to reject the whole null hypothesis would mean that we accept the alternative hypothesis, meaning that something did happen. Wow, amazing. We love to see it. Or are we failing to reject the null hypothesis because in statistics, we are never allowed to accept the null hypothesis? It's just weird statistics wordings. I don't really know why, but you failed to reject the null hypothesis, meaning that, yeah, we were right, nothing happened. And so both of those things are going to be introduced with your research questions. And these research questions are going to be based off of, what you actually are hoping to accomplish with your study and the type of data that you have available to you. And that's kind of all I think I had for that, unless anyone has any questions about that.
And one thing I do want to mention, because I know in qualitative research, sometimes you go to seek something and you don't find the answer or any answer. A friend of mine was an archaeologist, and for his master's thesis, he went to find something about a specific Civil War fort. Well, when he looked at the site that it was supposed to be at, but he could find no data to support even the state parks claimed that the fort was right there. And it took him a while to get past the fact that, a negative conclusion, while it's not as sexy to say I found nothing, it is still a conclusion. The research showed that where everyone thought this fort was, it wasn't.
That is very true for quantitative analysis as well. I tell people all the time, no results are still results. Not finding a difference between those two groups still tells you something about the two groups. And you should still be able to, or not finding a predictive relationship of maybe this variable on another variable still tells you something about the population and still tells you something about what's going on. And so even though we can find null results, and a lot of the times we do find null results, it still is a result, and it still means that you can talk about it in your discussion, and you can talk about the implications of those results as well.
Okay, let's see. Can we consider exposing participants to different stimuli that are manipulated to get their quantified reactions and then perform comparative tests as experimental research?
Yep. Yeah. I mean, that's pretty much the definition of experimental research. Different stimuli would be our two different groups. And if we're manipulating it, then it's definitely experimental. As long, and again, this is a big part of it, as long as we are randomly assigning people into these different groups, right? If, however, every single person in your data analysis is actually seeing all of these different stimuli, they're exposed to each and every different stimuli, that's actually going to be a non-experimental research, but it'll still be quantitative. So as long as you have that quantifiable data and their quantifiable reactions, it's still going to be quantitative data. But if we're looking at everyone's experiencing all of the stimuli, then it's going to be non-experimental or quasi-experimental. If maybe we're not random, but if we're randomly assigning people into stimuli number 1 versus stimuli number 2, and then we're comparing between stimuli and stimuli that you've manipulated, yep, that is a true experimental design. That is definitely a good design for you for an experimental design.
All right, let's move on to data collection.
Awesome.
Because this is something you've really got to think about. And, in general, how you run your data collection depends on the type of data that you're trying to collect and what data you can get available to you.
Mm-hmm.
And, we can talk more about these specifically. Kai, I'm gonna let you handle that with the quant methods, and then I'll take over with the qual methods.
Yeah, and I think like a lot of this is stuff that we've kind of already been talking about, but quantitative data, it really is based on what you have availability. So are you able to measure the concepts you want to look at? Can you answer it numerically? If it's something like stress, probably. There's a lot of stress tests out there, and there's a lot of measurable ways to measure stress. But maybe it's something like, I don't know, cosplay. Can you measure that? I couldn't measure that. Like, unless it's like, I don't know. I mean, you can make almost anything quantitative if you really want to. So maybe we are looking at cosplay, and the way you want to measure it is, okay, well, how many cosplays have you ever done? What's the number? And maybe we're looking at like, does something predict the number of cosplays? Does finances predict the number of cosplays you're going to do? Yeah, probably. And so, are you ever able to measure this numerically or not, is the biggest thing with quantitative data. And then also, how easy is that to access? Maybe you can measure something numerically, but it would be really hard to go get that. And maybe it's almost impossible to go to measure it. Even if you can measure it, maybe you don't have access to that population that you're interested in, and so maybe you want to look at something a little bit more generally. And so it really just depends on the type of data and the availability of that data that you have. And I believe that's probably similar for qualitative data as well. And so maybe
in different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. And so in terms of the quantitative data collection techniques, we've got surveys, we've got questionnaires. Those are really big in quantitative data, because these surveys have been pre-validated. They're surveys that have been out for a while in a lot of cases, and that a lot of people have used. And so since a lot of people have used those surveys, you can actually compare between the two research papers that use the same survey. And so a lot of quant stuff is surveys, questionnaires. We don't do a whole lot of interviews. And we don't do a whole lot of observational data, but it does happen. That's not to say that it doesn't happen. And then quantitative also can use a lot of archival data. And what I mean by archival data is data that it's already out there. A secondary data set. Maybe it's something that the government has posted. They do that a lot, right? They have that census thing. Or no, I'm kidding. I know about the census. But they have the census, right? And so maybe you're like, I'm going to use the 2012, or the 2022 census from the US Treasury Department as my, and I'm going to look at race and total gross income for the year kind of thing. Or maybe I'm going to look at profession and their race or gender or identity or something like that, right? And so a lot of people will use archival data as well. So data that has already been published, that's already kind of out there, and you're almost using it as a secondary data set that has kind of already been done. That is, though, to say that if you did use archival data, it would be a non-experimental design because we're not manipulating any variables here. But yeah.
And I do believe there's a continuation in the Q&A for you.
Oh, let me look. So if you have repeated measures, technically repeated measures is a quasi or a non-experimental design. However, that's again not to say that, because you're not randomly assigning people into, if they're doing it twice, you're not randomly assigning anyone into anything. So therefore it's not a true experimental design. But it could be a quasi-experimental design or a non-experimental design, and you would still be able to run quantitative analysis. Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about these with qualitative data collection. We mentioned all sorts of these things with availability. You can't collect data on something you can't access. And so you have all sorts types of data. You might want to collect interviews. Maybe you want to get specific linguistic traits from a group of people. Maybe you want to look at rituals or festivals. Maybe you're going to record video. So think about what types of data will help you answer the questions that you have. In addition, you do have to think about, and I'm sure to an extent for quantitative as well, the time it will take to collect that data. Because interviews take time to have. With interviews, you've got to schedule them. You've got to conduct them between usually 30 minutes to an hour each. Focus groups, 45 minutes to 90 minutes. If you're doing observations on a festival, how long the festival lasts, you have to be there for it. If you're doing some sort of participant observation, then what types of pre-performance participation is expected of you? How much time? How much money? How much time does it take to get to the data collection site? All of these things, if you're doing interviews, will they be face-to-face, on the phone? Will they be virtual, Zoom, Skype, Teams? How will you record all of this data?
And all of this does kind of fall in with quantitative as well. Like, are you doing it in person? Are we doing an online survey where we're just sending out a link? Stuff like that also does matter for quantitative as well. Again, sorry to cut you off, Johanna.
No. But no, we don't do a lot of surveys. I've got a few clients who will do a survey. The problem with a qualitative data survey is twofold. One, you have to be good at asking questions that will generate detailed, descriptive responses and not just get people rattling off like, yeah, I've seen client, and sometimes even with good questions, participants will go, yes, no, I'm not really sure. So and when you have that, a survey leads into the second problem. It doesn't give you a chance to follow up. Whereas in an interview, if someone says something that's not clear or that, oh, that was really interesting, can you talk more about that? Survey doesn't have that. Interviews, a lot of the data you get can be heavily dependent on the rapport you establish with your interlocutor and how much they trust and how much they're willing to open up, which can be dependent upon the location of the interview. I had one client who was trying to understand low test scores at schools that were on military bases owned by the United States throughout the world. And so she interviewed the teachers while they were on base, because all these teachers were members of the U.S. Armed Forces as well. So keep that in mind. On base, members of the military, she was asking them questions. Not only did they say the same things, they used almost to the letter the exact same words. And so I said, you're gonna have to go back and do some follow-ups off base. And when she asked them the same questions off base, she got different responses. Why? Because on base, they were concerned about their superiors hearing them say things that don't exactly, shall we say, toe the party line. And the same can be if, say, I've got clients who are interviewing people who work underneath them in a company. You don't want to tell your boss things that could get you in trouble, right? Or that could make them unhappy. And so these are things you have to account for. Observations, that's dependent upon how observant you are and where you're positioned in a specific framework. If it's a massive, say, a massive cathedral and you're on the back row of the pew, you're going to miss some things and details up front. If you're on the front row of the pew and say you're observing a traditional Latin mass in the Catholic Church, you'll get what the priest is doing, you'll get what anyone up front is doing, but anyone behind you, you're going to miss all of that. And so position, when we talk of your positionality, we're not just that, we also have to think about where we place ourselves in the research, not just who we are and what we bring to it in terms of expectations and assumptions and knowledge, but where we are when we do all of these things can impact the data we collect. Archival data. Sometimes we use that for triangulation. I mentioned with my master's thesis, with the exception of the archaeological data, which was contemporary archaeological research, most of the data I have came from archives, manuscripts. But because I was looking at specific manuscripts that are medieval, and even if you're looking at 19th century manuscripts, you often have to go to the place where the manuscript is. Research libraries are getting better about digitizing their collections of manuscripts, but not everything is 100% just yet. And so when you're going with the manuscripts that I've looked at for research, I had to be vetted. So I couldn't even begin making plans for the trip until I secured 3 letters of recommendation from major scholars in the field, attesting to the importance of my project, the credibility I had as a young scholar and a researcher, and the trustworthiness that I was not going to do anything to damage, destroy, or harm the collection. And so these are things you have to think about with, as I mentioned, the time consumption it takes to collect the data. Interview data has to be transcribed. Well, I'm going to use Zoom or Microsoft Word. You still have to check for transcription errors. I'm working really hard to make sure that my native accent doesn't come through. But if my accent comes through, Microsoft speech to text and Zoom often misunderstand what it is that I'm saying. And so that's something to think about. And if you're doing linguistic analysis, specifically looking at phonetics and phonology, that type of transcription can take between 3 and 4 times the length of an interview. Even then, like with looking at archival data, I was not allowed to photograph the manuscripts. I had to then handwrite the sections that I needed. And if you know anything, if you look at 17th, 18th century manuscripts, S's in English were written with a style that looked like an F. So if you don't know the differences in the orthography convention, handwriting, even block text from printers can be time consuming to translate and to transcribe. And then, with ancient manuscripts, you're working on handwriting on parchment, which if you don't know how that's erased, you take a razor blade and you thinly scrape. So you can only erase so many times. Plus, bookworms are a thing, and they ate the parchment in various places. And so sometimes you have to make your best guess at what a word was. So it's not always it's not something that even just collection takes time. Let me look at the Q&A. We'll be glad for assistance on developing questionnaires for the proposal. We will be sharing the webinar. However, we will talk later. If you would like assistance, we'll give you a number at the end to contact for scheduling a consultation. But data collection, you have to think about what you want to collect, how you want to collect it, or how you need to get it, and what is available, and definitely how much time it will take for you to gain access and to collect the data. And from there, we can move on to analysis. Kai?
Yeah, totally. And so I talked a lot about this a little bit earlier with the research question stuff. But data analysis, it depends. I hate saying it, but it does. It depends on how the type of data that you do have that you were able to collect. So open-ended questions or more difficult to measure concepts are going to be qualitative, whereas your closed-ended questions or your measurable variables are going to be more quantitative. In terms of data analysis methods, like I was saying earlier, we've got descriptive statistics, which is our means, our standard deviations, mode, median, range, that kind of stuff, frequencies, percentages, that kind of stuff. And then we have our hypothesis testing, which is based on the type of research question that you ask. So stuff like a t-test and ANOVAs, they are more comparative questions, or these are comparative designs, whereas a regression or a correlation is used for a more of a relational design or a predictive relational design. And so it does depend on that research question.
Do we want to hit the Q&A before we move on to qualitative?
Yeah, I just opened it. When do we use a cross-sectional design if one is considering a mixed methods? And how does one consider which one will lead the other, like questionnaire or interview? Yeah, again, hate saying it depends, but it does depend. And so, whether or not you're choosing which one's going to lead the other depends on kind of what more are you looking for, Are you looking to get a more holistic answer to the question that you're asking, or are you looking to get a more, set in stone, predictive relationships. There is a relationship, there isn't a relationship, there is a difference, there is not a difference. It depends on kind of what you're looking for stuff like that. And I don't know, Johanna, do you have any insights on that?
No, I mean, it's, it is that thing that we're always trying to say, and I always hated saying as a professor, but it will depend. And, you can tell us, oh, I want to study this, but without having the research questions, without knowing what framework you're approaching this from, and again, that's something we don't really have the time during a webinar to go into detail and discuss.
Yeah.
But, without having any of that information, the only answer that can be given is it's going to depend on a lot of the choices you make leading up to that decision. And so that's why you really need to be thinking about what it is you want to learn. What is it you're planning to, what are the questions? One, what is the problem that you're seeking to study? And what are the questions you're seeking to try to find answers to? And so that's why, and with qualitative, when you're analyzing the data to answer those big research questions, a lot of these are very similar: content analysis, thematic analysis, narrative, grounded theory, discourse. You're pulling out meaning from the utterances provided by your data set. Maybe you're trying to find patterns in the data. Oftentimes you will be doing a lot of these things where discourse analysis is less of a method for some and more of a theoretical understanding and framework. Where, for my master's thesis, I'm not doing my dissertation because my dissertation dealt with PTSD and suicidal ideation and the way that heroic discourse in political, professional, and popular American discourses impact the likelihood of soldiers and veterans seeking treatment for those things. It was really, really dark. So I'm trying to find something that's a little bit more fun to talk about in these, which is my master's thesis on boasting and masculinity in medieval Icelandic literature. So, but I use a discourse analysis framework. Generally, the big broad idea was things that are important to a culture group, people talk about repeatedly and in patterned, understandable, recognizable ways. And so that being the framework, I did a thematic analysis of the content, pulling out repeated ideas of, oh, this is clearly a boast, this is clearly an insult. Here's the content, it would be like boast, the physical prowess, boast, verbal acumen, insult, physical prowess, meaning you're calling your opponent weak or unskilled in combat, or a scrawny pencil neck geek, if you will, things like that. And okay, so where do we have with boast? What do we have with insults? What are the categories that all of these utterances fall into? And so to find the theme, sort of the content categories, the themes that emerged, I wasn't so much looking at the structure of these narrative episodes, so I wouldn't call what I did narrative analysis, but narrative analysis can look at discourse patterns. It can be critical. Friend of mine who inspired my undergraduate senior thesis, which was Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parsifal as a critique of the medieval Catholic Church. I analyzed the narrative and look for specific things that, here's what we know about medieval Catholicism and its belief sets. Here's what this Grail legend, the quote unquote epitome of the ideals of medieval Christianity, says about faith and about religion and about the church. And what happens if these things don't line up, which they didn't in many, many ways. But, so I did, that was more of a content narrative discourse analysis. Grounded theory analysis is specific to grounded theory, where you are trying to figure out a theory to explain a phenomenon, then you go back and check it against the new data set, make revisions, and back and forth. But more often than not, basically thematic analysis. I've already mentioned Vicki Braun and Victoria Clark, their 6-step method of thematic analysis, which is the most commonly used. It is one of the most tried and true methods. It's one of those that when you say, oh, I'm doing Braun and Clark's method, people go, oh, and they know exactly what you're going to do because it's so common and it's so trusted. And it is one of the most reliable forms of thematic analysis. And there are others. We don't have time, and it's unless you're particularly gung-ho on using them. I always suggest I suggest it to students and I suggest to clients, if you're uncertain but you want to look at themes, Braun and Clark's the way to go. It's simple, it's straightforward, it's easy to grasp, and virtually every scholar, now getting all scholars to agree on something is nearly impossible, but the overwhelming majority find it credible and reliable. So, but you do have to think about your methods because these take time. You will be poring over the data set. You will be reading transcripts again and again and again. You will be analyzing, you'll be putting things together. Sometimes your first round of groupings doesn't work and you've got to go back and try it again. And the process is labor intensive. It's tedious. I find it kind of fun because you're figuring out a puzzle, but it is something that does take quite a lot of time. So you want to budget a couple of months after data collection just for the analysis before you even start drafting the results. So it's something to think about, again, when you're choosing your method, do you want to spend more time up front, or do you want to move quickly into getting your data and then spend a lot more time on the back end? And so these are some steps to follow when you're choosing your method. What are the goals of your research? What is the problem you're responding to? What is the purpose, and what are your questions? Because that is all your research methods exist to be in service to the questions you seek to answer, which arise from the problem to which you would like to find at least the next step in solving. And then assess the feasibility. Can you collect the data? Can you collect the data needed to answer the questions? Can you get access to the population that you wish to study? Mm-hmm. Do you have time to do super in-depth data collection? Do you have the funds to go to the site that you may need to get to? Can you get those funds if you don't? What will you do if you can't get to that site? Consult the relevant literature. You don't have to just change method just to do something different. Sometimes using methods that have been used before, but a different set of eyes can produce different results, a different population. I know for qualitative, if I look at people who teach English language learners at the middle school level in Southwest Texas, and then I go and I study this, middle school teachers of English language learners in, say, Portland, Oregon, or in New York, I may have different results because it's a different population. And so maybe instead of changing the method, you just need to change the population. But sometimes if people have been using the same population and have gone nowhere, sometimes changing the method from what others have done can help find insight as to why the problem persists.
Yeah, that's a lot of quantitative research is looking at research that has been done before. And then are you going to replicate that research, or are you interested in expanding that research? And you could do a true replication where you do just exactly what they did, and no differences, to see if the data is going to kind of come up the same. Or are we expanding it? Are we trying to find a more generalizable sample here? Or are we maybe saying, hey, there was like an issue with this study that I found. I kind of want to rerun it and then fix the issue, and then kind of see what happens there, right? And so that's a lot of literature as well. Um, and then kind of with that, in terms of we were talking about populations, it kind of goes into the ethics thing,
Mhm.
and feasibility. Is the population that you're interested in, is it ethical to even to research them? A lot of people are interested, especially in psychology, which is my background. A lot of people are interested in, like, people who have diagnosable mental health issues, or people who have been traumatized by things, and a lot of the time, or maybe like even abused populations, stuff like that, right? Is it ethical to look at those types of people? Same with like marginalized groups. Are we only looking at one marginalized group and then using that marginalized group to extrapolate as a whole? You want to make sure that you're doing this ethically. And kind of like what I was saying earlier as well, it's not ethical to randomly assign people into categories that they already exist in. You don't want to randomly assign people's race. You don't want to randomly assign people's gender. And so maybe you really are interested in looking at that stuff, and you don't want to randomly assign it. Maybe a quasi-experimental design isn't for you. And so now, okay, the ethics kind of are leaning you towards a qualitative design. Or maybe it's the opposite way around, ethics
But even with ethics,
somewhere.
with qualitative, we do have to
Hmm.
think about a few things that you don't in quantitative.
For sure.
I know when I was dealing with PTSD and suicidal ideation amongst veterans, I had full IRB oversight. I mean, they were,
Mm,
because I was dealing with, you know, a protected population.
hmm.
And one of the things that we spent a lot of time in the IRB meeting discussing was, hey, in case you're uncertain, there is no statute of limitations on reporting war crimes.
Mm.
So if they mention something that fits the UN definition of a war crime,
You have to report
I
it.
had to report that.
Okay. That's interesting. Yeah.
It never happened. And so that's the ethics of, if I'm going to do this,
Are you willing to, yeah, are you, and maybe if you're not, then quantitative is the way to go,
but
you know?
also you have to disclose that to your potential
Okay.
participants that,
Yeah.
if you mention something that's a war crime,
We're
I
gonna
have
have
to turn
to,
you in.
yeah, yeah. I wonder if that's similar with psychologists are like mandated reporters and stuff for like mental health issues and stuff like that. I wonder if that's similar. I don't work with a lot of people like that. So, but I assume that it is, to be
I would
honest with
make the
you.
assumption as well, but also like I mentioned, some anthropologists who've studied, criminal organizations.
Hmm.
How do you balance the ethics of participant observation, where you participate in what you are
In something
observing,
criminal. Yeah.
with
Yeah.
something criminal, and then how do you disclose your status as researcher?
Hmm.
Because if they know that this is being recorded in some fashion, that could endanger your safety.
Totally.
So
Yeah.
these are all sorts of, and this is partially why we do IRB review before we get to the data
Absolutely.
collection stage, to make sure that you're aware of, you could really get yourself hurt, or these are the legal issues you have to know about. Because
Hmm.
you can go through the IRB course and they'll tell you all about the why and the whats, but they don't cover every possibly applicable law, because the IRB course doesn't always know every state law. Just because you're getting your degree at, say, NYU, doesn't mean that you're studying a population in New York.
Hmm.
You could be studying a population in, say, I don't know, Pennsylvania. So these are things you do have to think about. And that's why once you've gone through all of this, then you can choose the appropriate method to get to collect the data that you need to answer your questions and to then prepare you for analysis. And Bobby, thank you for joining us. Thank you for the comment, and do have a wonderful and safe holiday yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I appreciate that.
But yeah, methods are really the backbone of what you're going to be doing, because it does sort of help you structure your questions, your RQs. It is the study you will be conducting, and it leads up to and sort of suggests a method of analysis.
Exactly.
And so now we have a little bit of time left, but not much. So maybe one or two questions.
Although people have been asking great questions
Yeah,
kind
you
of
guys have been
throughout.
asking great questions and been keeping us on our toes. So
Yeah, honestly.
which I do appreciate that.
No, absolutely. A lot of the times, people are hesitant to ask questions, and
Q&A.
Oh, awesome. Can we test previously studied variable but on a new demographic category? Yeah, absolutely. Even if you don't have theoretical support about this category. Yeah, totally. So a lot of quantitative stuff is actually lacks in literature, so or gaps in literature, I should have said. So that's actually what my thesis study was. I didn't do it on a group that I had hadn't previously been done, but I looked at my study in my master's thesis, and I looked at all of the relevant literature, and I kind of looked at it all, and I was like, and I was very interested in misinformation. If you can't tell, I did my master's during the pandemic, and during 2020. And so misinformation was really important to me, and it was really interesting to me. And so I looked at a lot of misinformation paradigms, and something that I didn't see is I didn't see any literature on stress or timing. So when the stress is introduced, does make a difference on how susceptible you are to accepting that misinformation, accepting the lie. And so maybe, what if the stress is introduced before you see the misinformation? What if the stress is introduced after you see the misinformation? And kind of what I saw a huge lack of literature kind of talking about that, and actually having gaps in the literature is a reason to do something. It is a reason to look at something, and could be a very good reason. So maybe previous literature hasn't studied any of this, and why not? Let's look at it. Let's do it,
And that's the same thing is true with qualitative. That's how a lot of times you'll go, oh, we studied this, this, and this,
but like we didn't look at
not
this
on these people. Or
Yeah.
like with my dissertation, a lot's been studied on PTSD and suicidal ideation amongst veterans, but no one has systematically looked at the way discourses surrounding warrior heroism and masculinity in the United States impact the likelihood of seeking treatment.
Mm-hmm.
And so
yeah, totally.
I took people who'd been a topic that had been studied, but I found 3 sets of data, political speeches, professional literature on psychology, specifically the discourse, one renaming shell shock post-traumatic stress disorder, and then the more contemporary push to rename PTSD post-traumatic stress injury. And I looked at the way PTSD for combat veterans and suicidal ideation was presented in popular things, movies, video games, things of that nature, to show, really like the Rambo movies, which are a bit dated, but they were important movies at the time. The Deer Hunter movie, if you've ever seen that can be a hard movie to watch. But, looking at that, and you find that gap and you plug that in, you don't have to reinvent the wheel with a study.
Exactly. And
you
you
just have to
probably
find that
shouldn't.
place where there's needing grease.
Exactly. And kind of going off of what Johanna said, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. It goes back to that a good dissertation's a done dissertation. Don't go crazy. Don't be wild about this. And sometimes literally just seeing a gap in the literature, literally going, hey, we actually haven't looked at this effect on this group of people before. I wonder if it's different for them. do it, you know,
And
like
that is usually
do
enough
it.
of a justification.
Absolutely. That's more than enough. That's perfect justification. And then you can still kind of use the literature that way, saying like, hey, the literature doesn't even talk about this. It's kind of crazy.
Yeah.
We want to fix that, you know?
So with that said,
Yep.
let me remind you that Statistics Solutions is a full-service dissertation consulting company providing graduate students timely editorial support for their dissertations and other scholarly projects. We can help you all the way from topic development through preparing for your final defense and even turning your dissertation into a journal article or a longer study for a book. For more information about our services and to receive a free complimentary 30-minute consultation, these are available Monday through Friday, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Eastern United States time. Please contact Janine at the email there, janine@statisticsolutions.com, or our phone number, 727, let me rephrase that, country code 1-727-442-4290. We do have one final thing in the Q&A. Thank you. Well, thank you for joining us. We're happy to do this for you.
So much. Really appreciate all the
And
questions
it
y'all are
is,
asking.
I do believe our time is for the most part up. So
yeah, I do need to go get out of here.
On behalf of everyone at Statistics Solutions, we wish you the best of luck in your dissertations. We know you will be successful. If you need us, we are here to assist.
Absolutely.
And we hope every one of you has a lovely weekend. And I don't care what you were told. Don't write this weekend. Take a break. Get some rest.
Yeah, holiday weekend, y'all. Definitely take some time for sure. And enjoy the 4th of July if you celebrate.
That said, once again, thank you for joining us. Kai, thank you for doing this with me.
Yeah, thanks, Johanna. This was fun. I like talking with you always, you know.
As do I. So that said, we will let you guys go. You will receive a recording of this in about a week or so. Just be advised, for us in the United States, this is a holiday weekend, so it might be a little bit slower, but one will come your way. It will have the PowerPoint, and it will also have the recording of our
as
talk.
well. Exactly.
So once again, have a lovely rest of your day and a lovely weekend. Tschüss.